Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's newspaper, analyze the articles in detail and relevance for the prelims as well as the mains examination. Today, in total, we are going to have a discussion of around seven different topics, four of them in slightly greater detail, and three of them for their relevance in the prelims examination. Having said that, we are going to extract some of the portions of relevance even in these topics for the prelims. Now, first of all, now, two articles are of the same topic, that is associated with China and the US summit. And as we have been discussing about this, so this is an ongoing story. And as we had already said, that multiple new things would come to the fore and multiple new discussions would come to the fore. But here, both of them, they talk about the case of the role of China, the rise of China, and the peaceful coexistence with the US. And in one of the cases, the case where how China's rise is going to impact US. So here, this is relevant for your GS paper too. Now, India's EV ambition needs a grid strategy to match. This is an editorial piece which talks about that how, even though in the case of the fuel crisis and the fuel shortage, while the country is transitioning or seeking to transition to electric vehicles, we don't have the grid, the policy, or the structure to support electric vehicles in the long run. So, we will take this opportunity to analyze what are the lacunae, what are the challenges that we face, what can be the policy imperatives from the side of the government, and we can also take a look at the question, practice question from this. This is relevant for your GS paper 3. Now, watch but do not wait. This is associated with the ongoing Ebola crisis in Africa. Now, here, even though it is a follow up story to what we had discussed yesterday about Ebola, the case of casualties associated with Ebola, so we are not going to repeat the same thing again today. Today, what we are going to do is take a geopolitical aspect in terms of why is it so problematic to handle this particular Ebola outbreak? And why is it that WHO has immediately and in a kind of a very unusual way declared a kind of health emergency in the region? So, the locational aspect is something we are going to analyze, slightly relevant for your GS paper too. Now, India Vietnam deepen defense ties with focus on maritime security. The defense minister's visit to Vietnam has put light on India Vietnam defense deals and defense cooperation. Now, we are going to take a look into what are the existing defense cooperations which exist between India and Vietnam, and also the areas where we can expand our footprint. Then, canine distemper virus has claimed another life of the tiger in the Kanha Tiger Reserve. Now, what is this canine distemper virus and how does it impact the tiger population? So, that is something we are going to discuss. And Straits of Indian Ocean is an article in the international page which talks about the fact that while Strait of Hormuz is in a lot of discussion, there are two other straits of Indian Ocean which are very vital for the global trade, both in terms of the volume as well as in terms of the value. That is Bab al Mandeb as well as the Strait of Malacca. So, this is something that we are going to focus on today. Before we move ahead, again, an announcement for everyone appearing for the examination this year. The CSAT formula that you use in particular, for example, solving arithmetic and quant questions, that is something which many of the students have requested is a problematic area for you guys. So in order to solve that, we have come up with a formula cheat sheet which can be downloaded from the link provided in the description below. Do avail that and do accelerate your preparation and the chances of success in the prelims. Now, coming to the first article of the day, the China-U.S. summit that drew global attention. Now, this is an article in the editorial section written by none other than the Chinese ambassador to India. Now, first of all, we are going to consider two articles simultaneously so that we can have a comprehensive view about it. But let me give you a brief gist about what the article is about, okay, so that you have some context. So this article, where the Chinese ambassador basically tries to set the record straight, talks about the fact that there is a lot of discussion around the fact that the president's visit to China did not yield much tangible result. Right. After all, there's a huge amount of criticism going on in the US right now that the Trump's visit to China, in terms of the substance, is something that could be achieved just by an email. After all, there is nothing tangible that US has extracted, but it was a kind of a wear down and a tear down given to Trump by the Chinese leadership. In all fairness, all that is tangible, what the Chinese side has projected, is the case where the Chinese have said that US will now not interfere in the region of Taiwan. And Trump, on his part, has agreed to the story by saying that we are not going to interfere in a war which is 9,500 miles away from us. Secondly, as is the typical case with Trump, Trump made this pompous claim in front of the US media that the Chinese leadership has admitted that Vladimir Putin is regretting the invasion of Ukraine. And immediately, the Chinese foreign ministry denied any such claims being made. So it is a kind of a story which doesn't have any tangible outcome, neither in trade, nor in terms of the tech, nor in terms of geopolitics. But nonetheless, it is a kind of a thaw in the freezing of ties which have been witnessed for almost a decade now. Hostilities which started increasing ever since the Biden administration. And even prior to that, when the Chinese basically decided to cut the imports of the Boeing jets, now ranging from tech, that is the import of the GPUs, to the case of Taiwan, to the case of trade everywhere. So it is a trip that we have discussed is the case of the three B's and the three T's. The three B's being Boeing, beef, and the beans, that is the soybeans, and the three T's, that is Taiwan, tech, and trade. Now, three B's and three T's are the larger overall comprehensive analysis. One term which has been used here quite a lot is the case of Thucydides' trap. What is this Thucydides trap? That is something that we are going to have a brief discussion about. But overall, the Chinese ambassador to India is saying that look, both the countries can coexist together, cooperate in the regions of AI, cooperate for the future to be that of a coexistence, and India need not be scared. India need not be wary of the improving relations between US and China. India has its own development that it can take pride in. That is the gist of this entire article. And then you have another article in page 10, which talks about China's new worldview and the future of the global politics. Now, this talks about the Chinese worldview that look, for the past few years now, that at least in this particular decade of the post COVID era, China is seeing itself as the rise and the new geopolitical rise. It is seeing its rise as inevitable global situation. And that is where, when Xi Jinping talks about the changing geopolitical or the global order, he is basically saying that in the past century, this is the first time that the global geopolitical order is going to change. Now, in the early 1900s, mind you, the power of the world shifted from Europe to across the region of Atlantic into North America. And Xi Jinping is now seeing it as inevitable that now that power center is going to shift to China. So both have a different worldview. So let us analyze both these articles together. And what is this Thucydides trap that Xi Jinping has mentioned in the address to Donald Trump? And that is doing the rounds ever since this summit meeting took place. So when we talk about the Thucydides trap, now in that particular case, it was basically a term coined by the Greek historian Thucydides. Now, it was in the context of the Peloponnesian War of 431 BC, where he said that look, whenever there is a rise of a power, a new power, the existing power sees it as a threat. And there is an inevitable outcome that there will be conflict. That is the Thucydides trap. And basically, he said that Around 431 BC, the war, that is the Peloponnesian War, was inevitable. Why? Because the rise of Athens at that point of time was seen as a challenge by the Spartans. And that is where the Spartans waged a war. So, Thucydides' trap is what it says is that you have an existing power in the present context, you have an existing power that is US. A new power that is China is emerging. Now, as China's rise happens, US will perceive it as a threat. And invariably there will be a conflict in various different theaters, not only in terms of the military power, but conflict in terms of tech, conflict in terms of influence, conflict in terms of economy. There is bound to be a conflict. So that is what the Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping, and led by Xi Jinping, they mentioned it, that let us avoid this Thucydides trap and let us not fall into it. In fact, the historians, they have basically cited that out of the 20 such instances which have happened in the past couple of millennia, 17 of such instances have ended in a war-like situation, be it the rise of Germany in the case of the 20th century Europe, or in the case of Spain and the Ottomans. Everywhere there has been a war. Whenever an existing power is challenged, there is going to be a conflict. And history teaches us the same thing. So that is something which is being talked about in the present geopolitical context, right? So the even for example, one of the exceptions in this Thucydides trap, if you can think about it, let me know. All those of you who are reading world history, I will give you one of the exceptions. That is, in the 20th century, the rise of US to replace the colonial powers, that is UK, right? Now that did not end in a war in the 20th century. But any such instance that you are aware of, let us know in the comment section. Ottoman, Spanish, everything that we have talked about have ended in conflict, right? Now, there are multiple areas of cooperation which do exist between the Chinese and the US, right? Now, what are the areas of cooperation? First of all, globalization without predation. Now, both of them can set an example of a globalized world order, a very globalized world order. Now, globalized world order dictating free trade. Now, the problem with that is that the Chinese have basically exploited it to such an extent in the past 2 decades that, be it the region of Europe, be it the region of the US, be it the region of Asia, every country is scared or slightly wary of the Chinese. Because what the Chinese do is a kind of a predatory economics for that matter. Now they start flooding the market, the local market, with their own goods at a much cheaper price. And that completely replaces the local economic setup and the local production centers. As a consequence of that, eventually everyone is dependent on the Chinese imports, and then eventually they can control the market monopoly. In business terms, this is what you refer to as the Walmart strategy. That is what the supermarket chain Walmart uses as a business strategy in order to have a predatory economics and a kind of a predation of the local mom and pop stores or the brick and mortar stores. Walmart sells everything so cheap that the local stores run out of business, and that is where everyone is dependent on Walmart. So China is implementing that on a global scale. Now, because of this, for the past 2 decades, post the 1994 GATT order or the post WTO, China has utilized the aspect of globalization to dump steel, manufactured goods, everything, electronics in various countries. Take the case of India. If I give you the example of India, now in India, you have a very good example of this, that in early 2000s, we had a good rising pharmaceutical sector. We are still considered to be pharmacy of the world, isn't it? But in around 2000s, early 2000s, you had a good pharmaceutical sector. Now, in pharmaceutical sector, you have something known as API, that is active pharmaceutical ingredient. active pharmaceutical ingredient. Now, what is this? In every particular medicine or any particular pharmaceutical drug which is manufactured, there is some novelty value in terms of the chemical compound which is added, which improves the drug's efficacy or which provides efficacy to the drugs. Right. So, in a way, it is like the soul of that pharmaceutical drug, API. Now, in our country, in the early 2000s, the API was also, that API segment of the pharmaceutical was also rising. Multiple industries were investing in this API. But then what happened is that as we sought to improve the relations with China, remember, in the 2000s, we declared China as our strategic partner. Right, we sought to improve the relation where we thought that this will be the rise of the Asian century and India and China can be the strategic level partners. So at that point of time, we opened up our pharmaceutical sector to the Chinese imports. What did the Chinese do? They flooded the market with cheap API, right? Because of the large manufacturing capabilities that they had. And many of the times they do sell it at a lesser value also in order to replace your own industry. They flooded the Indian market with API. Obviously, Indian domestic market could not compete with it. Many of the drug companies who had this API research labs, they shut down because the other pharmaceutical industries, they were encouraged to import from China because it was cost effective. Now, 20 years down the line, we do not have the API manufacturing capability, which means what? We are restricted to manufacturing of the basic generic drugs. Any of the specialized drug, we are not able to manufacture unless and until imported from China. So that is where our pharmaceutical industry, it is still dominant in the world, but we are selling the low value drugs. We are not able to sell or export the high value drugs. Why? Because the API sector is now controlled by China. If tomorrow, let's suppose we sever all the threats or all the various different ties with China, China will simply stop exporting the APIs. Our pharmaceutical sector will be brought to its heels. Imagine the number of job losses that will happen. That is something that we experienced post the COVID pandemic. After that is when eventually the government and the sector woke up, and now there are some initiatives to restart the API segment in pharmacy. But again, it is a long drawn process. It cannot be done overnight. You cannot revert what has happened in the past couple of decades. So this is something which has been used by China in order to completely dismantle the steel sector in Europe, even in the region of Asia and Africa. India has been very protective of the steel sector, but that has yielded some amount of impact to us. Right. So, globalization without predation, these two countries can practice this. Because of these Chinese policies, the entire world is slightly shifting to the right principle of, or the right winger principle of economy. That is protectionism, right? Every country is seeking to be protectionist, and that is where deglobalization is on the rise. So both the countries can set the examples correct. Then AI is the new medium where, and the new frontier where both of them can cooperate, collaborate. Then you have space research in terms of, let's suppose, the solar phenomena. Space research does not only mean exploring life in space. You have multiple different aspects where, for example, the even when we talk about the higher atmosphere like mesosphere, that property needs to be understood properly, right? When we talk about ionosphere, how it behaves, that needs to be understood properly. That is where international cooperation is required. How to handle space debris, which is increasing day by day, that needs to be handled carefully. For that, international cooperation is a must. So space research, medical research, cancer research, HIV research, this is where both these countries can actually cooperate and move ahead into the future, right? So that is where there are multiple avenues of cooperation despite the case of the conflict. And that is how they can actually avoid the Thucydides trap. Right? Now, the rise of China is something that the world has not, and rise of a power at this speed is something that the world has not witnessed since the rise of US. But one can argue that rise of US was more spread over 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 decades. Rise of China is something which is more sudden, right? So, and very, very uh, immediate and steep. China is not only challenging US, is surpassing US in terms of the global technology, in terms of the military power, in terms of the case of the dominance in the region. It has surpassed. So that is why Trump cited the term G2, that the world is going to witness how these two powers behave, right? We are again nearing the region of a bipolar world, something that the world had not seen since post Soviet era. But again, we are coming to the case of the superpowers. China is a superpower in the present day. And we, being in the immediate neighborhood, we will have immense amount of impact. If, let's suppose, tomorrow China is already hostile to us, but China is concentrating its gaze towards the Pacific, towards US. If China turns its gaze and its entire effort towards India, then India will have a massive destabilizing effect, right? So China's worldview is basically China is seeking itself as a leader of the world in the coming days. It is inevitable now. Everybody in the world is accepting that it is going to be inevitable. So China wants to control the global narrative. What China is seeking to do is that, look, and it is creating a narrative which is partially correct in this case, that US led world order had been the case of dominance, had been the case of partiality. Post Second World War, US had set up the Bretton Woods institutes like IMF, World Bank, etc. Now, they would provide funding only to those countries which were very much obedient towards US and so on. Now, China is also partially doing the same, but China is seeking itself to be the leader of the multilateral world order. And that is where you can see the various initiatives that have been launched by China: Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative. All these are Chinese led initiatives now because China sees its increasing role as a global leader, right? But these can be relevant even for your prelims examination, by the way. When we talk about, let's suppose, the case of GDI, Global Development Initiative. What is Global Development Initiative? Now, it is something which was initiated or which was proposed by Xi Jinping at the UN General Assembly in 2021, talking about how the world can come together to achieve sustainable development goals in the post COVID pandemic era. And that was in a way to whitewash the Chinese effect or the blame on China for the spread of COVID. So that is where the Global Development Initiative was actually launched. Now, what was the Global Development Initiative? 8 different focus areas: poverty reduction, food security, COVID 19 response, financing for development in a multilateral way, climate change and green development, renewables and transition, industrialization, digital economy, and connectivity. All these were being championed by China. So, the Global Development Initiative is to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, right, by 2030, seeking to voice the developmental requirements of the global south, right, which have been, as per China, ignored by the developed countries of the world. Right. Now, here, the other aspect, that is the Global Security Initiative. Now, this is something which was a kind of a reaction, the Chinese reaction to the reinvigoration of Quad, right? Quad, basically the grouping of India, US, Japan, and Australia, seeking to upend the Chinese dominance in the Indo Pacific region. So, China saw it as a threat. Now, full credit to China that China has virtually, with the help of Mr. Donald Trump in this case, completely thrown a spanner in the progress of Quad. Quad is now non functional or dysfunctional, to say the least. Now, that global security initiative was a response of China to NATO, Quad, and other such Western led security parameters. So it was proposed by Xi Jinping in 2022 at the Bao Forum for Asia to promote a new framework for international security based on cooperation, dialogue, and mutual respect. Now, what are the implications for India? The Chinese rise and the changing geopolitical order. First of all, India presently is in no state or does not have enough leverage, for that matter, substantive leverage. We can have an argument for the sake of it that no, we are the largest population, which we are. But in terms of the per capita income, in terms of the GDP, in terms of even the hard power, in terms of any of the aspects, diplomatic outreach, we do not have the heft till now in order to challenge the existing world order or to force the world into multilateralism rather than the bipolar structure. So, our progress is essential. We need to grow and we need to grow very, very fast. Along with that, we need to have an era of peace. India needs an era of peace. For example, here we can take the leaf out of China's book. Now, China, through from the 80s up till around the last decade, actively avoided any international conflict because it wanted to rise. Even right now, it is not seeking an active conflict with US because it sees the next decade as very important in order to upend the global order. So we need the next 2 to 3 decades of peaceful scenario, multilateralism, so that we can actually grow. And we need that only in order to ensure that the population of our country is benefited. Areas of cooperation, that is something which we have to negotiate with China. Market access, agricultural exports, technology transfer, that is where we can cooperate. Increased cooperation with US. We have to manage the relation with China and the US. At the same time, we have to collaborate with like minded countries in Europe, Africa, and the global south in order to ensure progress across the regions of climate change and global leadership. Okay? Now, the world is witnessing a new Thucydides trap moment. Discuss. Now, in this particular case, there can be multiple ways in which you can introduce the answer. One of the very direct way of introduction, one of the direct ways of introduction is what? You start with the case of Thucydides trap. What do you understand by Thucydides trap? So it talks about the scenario in the international diplomatic or international political relations where the rise of one power is sought to be or is seen as a challenge by the existing power structure, and there is an inevitable conflict which has happened, right? That can be one way to introduce, and then you go into the body portion where you relate it with the case of the China and the US. The other way to introduce is that you start with the case of the China's rise. You start with it. China's rise in the present geopolitical world order is unprecedented in the past century, and that is being akin or that is being seen to be similar to the Thucydides trap. Then, in the body portion, just mention in one sentence what that means. Okay, so that is how there are different ways in which you can introduce. I would ask you to introduce it in the second way. That first you set the context of the China's rise related to the Thucydides trap, and then in the body portion after that, you start mentioning about the case of the regions of conflict, areas of conflict from economy to the case of AI, to the case of tech, right? There you can talk about the GPU, something that we have been discussing about over the past 2 to 3 days. Then you can talk about the case of Taiwan, right? And the other areas of global dominance. So these are the areas where you can discuss. Yesterday, I told you about the 80-20 rule in the 10 marker question. 80% of your answer has to address everything which has been asked in the question. 20% you can devote to those areas in the nearby vicinity. So in this particular case, also 20% of the later part of your body, you can talk about that conflict or the era of conflict will not yield positive result either for these countries or for the larger geopolitical world order. So that is where the two countries need to facilitate dialogue, need to cooperate, and that will be beneficial for India as well, right? Or what you can do is, this is one way. The other way is that you can talk about the India's opportunity. India can be seen to be the forefront or the advocate of the global south, and talk about the case of the Indian rise is also something which is required by the world. Okay, that can be your conclusion as well. Please understand, you try to write answer in different manner, different ways, and then get it evaluated, because no particular answer is the only correct answer. There are multiple different types in which you can express your answer. Okay. Now, India's EV ambition needs a grid strategy to match. Strait of Hormuz is in news and the fuel supply is in shortage. Across the world, people are experiencing price shocks, and so is the case in our country. Now, the of the fuel was increased yesterday as well, but there is still argument which can be made that the price has not been increased to the extent as compared to the international market. The price should have been increased immediately after the outbreak of the conflict, right? We waited for almost a month and more in order to increase the prices, by which the oil marketing companies are already running into severe erosion of funds on a day to day basis. So there can be an argument made regarding that, but nonetheless, the daily commuters who use scooters, who use basically the cars for the city traffic, now they are basically exploring options of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, first of all, now, there they are cheap in terms of the mileage. That you don't have to rely and you don't have to be dependent on the changing fuel prices, right? So the article argues that from Pune to Patna, everybody is exploring electric two wheelers, and that can change the scenario of Indian transportation sector. But what everyone is ignoring right now is the fact that with more number of electric vehicles, you will need a greater amount of electricity generation as well. And not only the two wheelers, in our country, the fuel guzzling transportation sector is basically which one? The the high carrier vehicles, or basically the high load carrier vehicles like your trucks, the containers. These guzzle huge amount of fuel. Now, if you go for the electrification of the trucking fleet, imagine the amount of electricity which is required, and also we do not have enough infrastructure, charging stations, etc. That is not present. So that is what the article talks about, that your grid is not ready. Okay, your infrastructure is not ready. If today everybody makes a conscious decision that we will buy only electric vehicles despite the fact that they are costly, the system is not ready. Okay, so what needs to be done? That is something that the article discusses about. So first of all, what are the challenges that we face? We have close to around 420 million registered vehicles, almost the third largest in the world after US and China. Full electrification would require 900 to 1100 terawatt hour of electricity annually. Just to give you reference, overall we generate close to around there are difference in terms of the peak seasons, but close to around 1900 to 2000 terawatt hour of energy is generated in our country, right? So electric vehicles themselves would demand close to around 1100 terawatt hours of energy, right? Even with only 50% EV penetration by 2047, we will require around 500 terawatt hour of extra electricity. It is like creating a new electric grid itself, right? Almost doubling your electricity generation capability. Now, how do you do that? Renewables have a problem, that renewables are very fluctuating. You need enough battery storage structures. The efficiency rate, for example, in solar and wind power, Now, solar and wind power, the renewable sector, now they basically will allow for early expansion. Setting up of a thermal power plant is a long drawn process, right? So they will allow you to scale up very quickly. Installation cost is there. But then the problem with this is the storage. You can only generate enough power during the daytime in case of the solar power. During the night time, you don't have that. So for that, you need the battery tech, in which we don't have enough technology. We lack the tech in order to develop our indigenous batteries, right? So battery tech is lacking in this case. Now, other case where we can add huge amount of power at one go in a cleaner environment, because we need to be mindful of the climate change as well. That is the case of, let's suppose, the modular nuclear reactors. Modular nuclear reactors. Now, this is where, for example, when we talk about the case of uh, the Shanti bill, which has been passed, that allows for the setting up of the modular reactor. So these kind of initiatives can be taken, right? But here, when we talk about the demand is huge. Only the two wheelers, right? We are one of the largest market for the two wheelers. Two wheelers themselves will contribute to around 55 to 75 terawatt hour. Now, when we talk about the heavy goods vehicle, HGVs, heavy goods vehicle, they have a huge amount of consumption. They themselves would require around 500 terawatt hour per year. And you also require what are referred to as the case of electrification of the roads. Electrification of the roads. Now, electrification of roads. Now, what is the meaning of this? For example, in Germany, that is a different implication of electrification, right? That is not meant in this article. In Germany, for example, you have the electric lines, just like the railway lines, the electric lines over the case of the roads, and the trucks, just like the locomotives, have started using the pantographs in order to extract that electric energy. This article is not talking about it. This is talking about the development of electric charging stations, right? The infrastructure development of infra. For example, charging stations. Now, if you will have the charging stations, or if you have, let's suppose, the heavy goods vehicles, they can require charging anywhere, and they will use a high amount of charge. For that, you need reliable, uninterrupted power supply to these charging stations. You need enough infrastructure created around that, and it is not something which can be done overnight. It will take a long period of time to do that. You need to provide tax incentives to do the same, right? Now, there are multiple issues. That is the electrification of the supply chain, charging stations, the modular stations in between, in the pathway, etc. Now, here, the problem is not just the case of the huge amount of electricity, but the peak demand, particularly during summer months, etc. How do you manage the peak demand? There is a tiny bit of story in today's newspaper as well, that already our peak demand is at the highest. Peak demand is the amount of electricity that you take out of the grid, and that is very high in our country during the summer months. Now, how do you address the peak demand without breakage, without interruption? Majority of the grid in our country requires upgradation. So that is where the grid upgradation is very, very much required, right? But how do you upgrade the grid? Majority of your distribution companies are running into massive losses. And the discoms, the health of the discoms are a problem for us, right? So if the discoms are not doing good, you cannot expect them to upgrade, you cannot expect them to revitalize the grid, because eventually, one of the problem with the grid and the poor condition of the grid is that you have huge amount of attenuation and transportation loss, ANT loss, right? Attenuation and transportation. So when energy is generated, from that it is transported for a long distance, there you have huge amount of losses. So you need a smart grid, right? And for that, distribution companies' health needs to improve. So the government needs to come up with the policies to improve the health of the discoms. Here, much of the problem is also with our subsidization policies, right? The case of the free electricity that we provide. Now, what that means is that you have a lesser time or lesser fiscal leeway in order to improve the grid structure or improve the revenue. For example, that leads to what is known as cross subsidization. Cross subsidization or eventually increased revenue. For example, if let's suppose I give free electricity to some people in the region, so in order to overcome my losses, I will have to increase the electricity price for the industries. So that means the industries, their cost will increase, their profitability will reduce, and they will start moving out. So that is where we need to have a very logical and a kind of a pointed thought process in order to improve the health of the distribution companies. Another problem that we are facing is that multiple people have been buying electric vehicles for some time now. But how to manage those electric vehicles which are nearing the end of their life cycle? How do we manage that? For example, the electric vehicles use batteries, right? The batteries have a lifespan. Now, many of the electric vehicles are nearing the end of the life cycle for the batteries. How do you manage that? That is a problem. So, we don't have a policy structure for recycling of the batteries also. So, that policy needs to be arrived at as quickly as possible. So, what are the solutions? Electricity pricing, that has to be variable based upon the timing in which you use the electricity. For example, renewables, they will generate maximum power during daytime, so that is when you advise the people to charge. You incentivize the electricity during the daytime. During night time, when the renewables are not on the grid, that is when you spike up the price, so that the electric vehicles, they are not charged during the night time to such an extent. Workplace charging during the solar rich daytime hours. Battery storage at the charging hubs. Swapping network for batteries for the lighter vehicles. Now, huge volume of new electricity generation has to happen. Reliable round the clock supply for freight depots and urban charging networks in the warehouses, along with multiple policy measures. What are the policy measures? Integrate electric vehicles demand projections into the national electricity pricing, right? Even now, when we talk about the energy demand, energy consumption, and the energy projection for the next couple of decades, electric vehicles don't figure out in our plans. That needs to be sorted. Mandate smart charging standards, conduct joint transport power planning for freight corridors, strengthen the distribution companies' finances through reforms. Okay, so these measures are required to be taken in great alacrity, great urgency. Only then will we observe some amount of improvement and a greater and a faster adoption of cleaner tech. Now, India is still not ready for clean energy transition, discussed by concentrating on the transportation sector. Now, how do you write the answer for this? In the intro, what do you write? What you can do is that you can start by saying that India's energy consumption is also dominated by the transportation sector, which still relies heavily on the fossil fuel. Being a net importer of fossil fuel, this transportation sector and the logistics cost are oftentimes price sensitive, and they are impacted by the shocks, the price shocks, right? There you have set a context. What is this context that you have set up? You have set a context where you have linked the energy demand directly to the transportation sector. Why? Because the question is telling you concentrate on the transportation sector. Right. So you have said that energy demand is high. Transportation sector is one of the major ones. Right. Now, after that, in the body, you talk about that transportation sector. We have one of the largest vehicle fleet across the world. It handles the huge amount of freight traffic, passenger traffic, etc. And then you talk about the implications. What happens if there are global supply shocks? You have increased import bill, you have increased logistics cost, you have inflation, currency depreciation, that you can express in a box in a point-wise manner as well. Now, then you start highlighting the issues, right? First, implications. In order to indicate, why do you write the implications first? Generally, implications are written later on. Here, you are writing implications first. Why? In order to indicate here, for example, that how, when we talk about the case of transportation sector, why that needs to transition to the case of electric vehicles. Then the issues that we have discussed, then talk about the solutions, the possible solutions, okay? And then eventually, when you talk about the conclusion, in the conclusion part, you write or you talk about energy transition is not an option, but an essentiality for the largest population of the world, because climate change is upon us. In order to reduce the emissions and ensure that frontiers of economic growth and environmental sustainability are attained, this energy transition is paramount or is dependent on the transition of the electricity or the transportation sector. Policy measures, like some of them you mentioned, now they are imperative for India achieving that goal and eventually achieving the true sense of Atmanirbharta. So, like that, you can conclude. Okay. Now, then, coming on to the next article, watch but do not wait. This is about the Ebola crisis. Now, yesterday we had discussed that this is the case of the Ebola crisis strain or the Ebola strain, that is the Bundibugyo strain. Bundibugyo strain. Now, here, the death rate is very high. Casualty figures are very high. Outbreak has happened in which part of the world? In this part of the world. We will take a look at it with the help of the map also. That is eastern part of DRC and the bordering region of Uganda. Now, WHO has immediately declared a public health emergency, global health emergency in this particular case, because the number of deaths have increased to 131 and more, and there is a suspicion that the actual number of diseases or the disease incidence would be much higher than what is actually depicted. That is a suspicion, right? So in this particular case, if we take a look at it, so first of all, let us understand the context and then let us understand the issue in handling that crisis. First of all, WHO has declared Ebola outbreak in Central Africa a public health emergency of international concern due to outbreaks scale, spread, and uncertainty. There have been confirmed lab cases, right? People who are testing, they are also impacted. Out of 13, 8 have turned out to be positive. Now, this is the Bundibugyo strain of Ebola, an uncommon strain for which the existing vaccines and the therapies, they have not yet been fully tested. So if you take a look at the region of the map of Africa, this is the region which is impacted. Now, what is exaggerating the issue is that this area of the world is very unstable. There are ongoing civil wars and there are rebel groups in the region, and there is huge amount of displacement of population from Uganda into the region of the DRC. Particularly, if you take a look at the micro map of the region, you have two provinces, that is the North Kivu and the South Kivu. Now, it is in this region where the spread has happened of the Bundibugyo strain. Now, in this particular case, what has happened is that you have huge amount of influx of population in these areas. So, when you have migrating population, it is not easy to screen everyone. And also, it becomes a kind of a taboo that how are you talking about the case of Ebola in this particular case, or why are you mentioning, or if let's suppose somebody is detected with Ebola, they will be isolated. So, not everybody immediately reports it and it starts spreading much more easily. The rebel groups in the region like M23, etc., what they have done, they have captured this Goma airport. Now, the capture of this Goma airport means that, let's suppose, the vaccines which need to be flown into, now that is not something which is available. Even the people from, let's suppose, Medicine Sans Frontières or Red Cross, they are unable to reach the location. So that is where you will find that the problem can only exaggerate from here. So, what is required? A peace in that region is a long lasting dream for the population in the region. But nonetheless, you can have the UN enforced screening areas, the blue helmets, that is the UN peacekeeping force, can be deployed in this region. And that is where you can basically have a much greater screening, lab testing, isolation of the population, and thereby ensure that this doesn't become a global pandemic. Okay. Now, coming to certain articles relevant for the prelims. Now, India and Vietnam deepen defense ties with focus on maritime security. Now, India and Vietnam have been increasing their defense ties for the past few years. In the rise of the belligerent China and the dispute in the South China Sea, that is where Vietnam is seeking to improve relations with India as well. Now, in this particular case, there have been multiple different talks associated with certain defense platforms. Now, the present context of the article is the defense minister's visit to the region of Vietnam. And that is where high level delegation meets have been held. You had the inauguration of the language lab in the Air Force Officers College with the help of India in Vietnam. That has happened. But what are the defense collaborations which are already in works with and between India and Vietnam? First of all, BrahMos. Now, there is an ongoing talk about the transfer of BrahMos missiles, the shore based BrahMos missile battery, to Vietnam so that they can have the protection against the Chinese Navy. Remember, BrahMos was originally developed as an anti ship missile, right? So it can substantially help the Vietnamese coastal defense and managing the disputed region in the South China Sea. But it is still an ongoing development. There are certain areas where we have actually moved ahead. One is the transfer of the Kukri class corvette to Vietnamese Navy. That we have done, right? It has been transferred to Vietnam, right? Then, other than that, even the training of the Vietnamese Air Force based on our on the Su-30. So we operate the Su-30 Mark 1, right? So MKI rather, Su-30 MKI, that is India specific. So Su-30 MKIs that we operate. Now, Vietnam is also operating Su-30. So the training, the people-to-people exchange in Air Force, the technology discussion that happens between the Vietnamese Air Force and the Indian Air Force as well. So there are multiple areas of cooperation. We are also cooperating in terms of the space tech, where ISRO's satellite tracking station is to be established in the region of Vietnam. So there are multiple areas of collaboration. But the Chinese Navy, which is the world's largest navy now in terms of the number of vessels, now that is where we need to have a greater amount of cooperation in the maritime domain, including submarines, servicing, and the Joint Logistics Pact, which can be worked ahead in the future. Now, here, CDV, six tiger dies of suspected CDV. Now, CDV is basically canine distemper virus. Canine distemper virus. Now, this canine distemper virus has killed a lot of feline species in the past. For example, the very infamous outbreak of CDV in Tanzania, in the Serengeti region of Tanzania, managed to kill 1,000 African lions. Right. So this can spread. How does this spread? This spreads from, particularly in this particular case in Kanha, it is suspected to be spreading from the dogs, the feral dogs. Now, they are impacted by the CDV. Their excretion, etc., that also carries the CDV virus or the canine distemper virus. Now, what is its overall impact in the feline species? When we talk about the feline species, so here they infect the tigers through contact with the bodily excretions, right? And here, once the tiger gets contaminated, so by the various food items, etc., that is where they can get impacted. Now, eventually, the virus replicates itself in the lymphoid tissue in the respiratory tract. It breaks the blood and the brain barrier and starts impacting through the cerebro fluid, right? Cerebrospinal fluid, and that can cause seizures within the tigers. They replicate themselves in the gastrointestinal tract of the tigers, and that is where it further spreads to the other species as well. So that is how the canine distemper virus can spread. Okay, so this is a major problem for the feline species across the world. Now, the last article. Besides Hormuz, two more straits in Indian Ocean are vital for global trade. Now, this article basically talks about the fact that Hormuz Strait is in news because it tends to basically provide a linkage between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, handles huge amount of oil traffic, but there are, because of the nature of the Indian Ocean is not as open as, let's suppose, the Atlantic or the Pacific. The geography of the Indian Ocean, as you can see in the image, now it is closed. So there are two other straits which also serve as the bottleneck. One of the strait is basically in the west, around the region of Gulf of Aden, that is Bab al Mandeb. This is the region of Bab al Mandeb, right? Or known as the Gate of Tears. Now, this Bab al Mandeb in the west, and you have the Strait of Malacca in the east. Strait of Malacca. Now, they basically handle huge amount of bulk cargo shipping, right? So each year in the Indian Ocean alone, we witness close to around 100,000 ships which tend to move from one region to another, right? And annually, around 80% of global oil trade, global oil trade that happens to occur through the region of the Indian Ocean. So that is where it is very, very vital. If you take a look at the location of it, Bab al Mandeb tends to connect the Red Sea with the region of the Gulf of Aden. Now, at its narrowest point, it is around 20 kilometers wide, roughly around 20 kilometers wide. This is also an area of conflict. With the outbreak of the Iran crisis, the Houthis in Yemen basically they have threatened the shipping vessels in this region. Remember, when you had the Israeli offensive in Gaza, at that point of time, the Houthis were targeting the merchant vessels in the region, which had increased the shipping cost in the region, the insurance cost in the region, right? So that Bab al Mandeb is already in crisis. The number of attacks have reduced, but the Iranian-backed Houthis, they can anyway resort to that violent cycle once again. The other region is the Gulf of Malacca. Now, that has been cited by the Chinese leadership as a problem because the Strait of Malacca, rather, this Strait of Malacca has been cited as the Chinese leadership as a problem, strategic problem. Why? Because here, when we talk about the case of the entire eastern seafront of China, now that is served by the shipping traffic from the Strait of Malacca. That is why the Chinese have been thinking about for some time now to build a canal network through here. That is the Isthmus of Kra. But nonetheless, Indonesians had started floating the idea that we should charge levy for the ships traveling through the Strait of Malacca. It is a longer strait in comparison, much narrower than Bab al Mandeb, but nonetheless is a vital choke point in the Indian Ocean. The straits of the world are important for this year's prelims, so please ensure that you revise them sufficient number of times. Okay, that brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. If you have liked the content, put that in the comment section and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. We'll meet again tomorrow. Take care. Goodbye. Thank you.